So our conditional statement there is if you are 21 years old, then you are of legal drinking age. So again, our hypothesis is simply just the part that follows the if. So you are 21 years old. All right. So the statement is you are of legal drinking age. All right. So let's go ahead and take a look at the second example. Now our second example says state the converse of the conditional statement. So what's the converse mean? Good, that's where you switch the if and the then. All right, so if we're switching that, now it becomes if you are of legal drinking age. All right, then you are 21 years old. So now we need to define a new word. Notice now we're seeing both. We're seeing the word negation used on there. All right. The negation means the denial of a statement. All right, the denial of a statement. That's what negation means. The denial of a statement. We've also got another word there that we haven't seen, and that's inverse. So the inverse is formed by negating both the hypothesis and the conclusion of a conditional statement. The easiest way to see that defined is by taking an example. So if you look at example 3, it says, if you pass the tax test, then you will graduate. All right. So an inverse, again, is when we are denying that statement. All right, that's when we would have something like, if you do not pass the tax test, then what? All right, if you do not pass it, then you will not graduate. So the key there is not. All right, we've added not both in our hypothesis and our conclusion. That's what an inverse is. So looking back at our definition of the inverse, all right, the inverse is formed by negating or denying both the hypothesis and the conclusion of the statement. So this kind of helps you define all the different parts that we see there. It helps us in defining what exactly negating mean. Right? Denying it, that's what our not is. All right? Denying it is the same thing as our not. That's our negation part. That's when we're making it not happen. Right? So if we were to have something like, if you win the World Series, all right, that's our initial. That could be our hypothesis of a statement. So our inverse of that, or our negation of that, would be if you do not win the World Series. All right, it's just simply taking the opposite of it. All right, let's look at another example. Let's look at example 4. 4 says, write the inverse of the statement. Determine if its inverse is true or false. If it's false, make sure you give a counter example. All right, a counter example. That means showing that, showing an example of when it is, in fact, false. So if you'll take a look at that example. If school is in session, then it is a weekday. So if you'll write the inverse of that, determine if that is true or false, and then if it's false, give a counterexample. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. So if school is in session, then it's a weekday. So what's the inverse of that?
If school's not in session, then it's a weekend.
If school is not in session,
it is not a weekday. Yes, whatever.
all right, the key word there again is not. Then it is not a weekday. So if that's the inverse, is that true or false?
False.
If school is not in session, then it is not a weekday.
It's false. True. Yeah, it's true. It's
false. Right. Well, if you think it's false, some of you said false. So if you think it's false, what would be a counterexample that would prove that it's false?
Holidays and summer.
All right, holidays.
School's not in session though.
Summer, it's not in session. So if it is not in session, it is not a weekday. So let's say we're not in session, like you said. Let's say we're not in session on Christmas break. All right. All right. How about on? Well, it says it is not a weekday.
It's one long weekend, guys.
One very long
Haven't
weekend.
you heard of those 3-day weekends or whatever it is?
I put false. I didn't think it was supposed to
20-day weekends. Whole
Right.
summer weekends.
Well, again, it is false. And again, an example of that would be summer. All right. Or a student holiday during the week. Right. If school is not in session, all right, so we're not in session in the summer, then it's not a weekday. Well, it's weekday in the summer. So that's an example that proves it otherwise. If there's even one thing that makes it not true, it's false. Let's say I took an example of a problem. Let's say we said that we had, again, 2 over x is always a real number. 2 over x is always a real number. It is always a real number, except for one time. When is that one time? When x is what? When x is what? Someone said it. It's false, because when x is 0, then 2 over 0 is undefined.
Yes.
So if I were to have that statement, that one example, that's the only case that happens. All right? That it makes it not a real number. All right? So that's one example of it. Now we could get into talking about imaginary numbers as different examples, but that one number right there, if we're just talking about integers or rational numbers, that makes it false. All right, so if one thing makes it false, then the whole statement's false. All right. So summer, again, is an example, or any holidays, student holidays. All right. Now, another word that we're looking at, a contrapositive. All right, a contrapositive is formed by negating both the hypothesis and conclusion. Of the inverse. I'm sorry, of the converse, that should say. Sorry.
Of the converse?
Of the converse.
Okay.
That wouldn't have made any sense.
Yeah.
That would have been the same statement.
Yeah, let's just go back. Yeah.
So our example 5 says to write both the converse and the contrapositive of the conditional statement that's given below. So if you run a red light, then you are breaking a traffic law. So I'll give you just a second to write the converse and the contrapositive you think you should have for that. All right, so on that, your converse. If you are breaking a traffic law, you must be running a red light. Remember, the converse is when we are switching the hypothesis and the conclusion, right? So our converse is when we simply switch those. Then our contrapositive is when we are negating that. All right? So if you are not breaking a traffic law, then you must not be running a red light. Now, this one doesn't ask us if that's true or false, but is that a true or false statement? That's false. Right, just because you're not running the red light does not mean that you are, or if you are not breaking a traffic law, then you must not be. Well, actually, I'm sorry, that would be true, right?
You can, if you speed.
But if you're speeding, but that means you are breaking a traffic law. But the rule says you are not breaking. So if you're not breaking any traffic laws, then you must not be running the red light. And you must not be speeding, and you must not be doing any of that stuff to not be doing any of it. So the converse of it, if you are breaking a traffic law, you must be running a red light. So the converse could have been false, but the contrapositive is true. Right? And again, what we're doing here is we're looking at these things and starting to think about ideas of why could something not happen, or what's an example of this not occurring. Because we're going to use these as we move into what's called proofs next class. That's when we're going to start taking things and we're going to start using the language to prove if it's true or if it's not true. All right, both real life situations and then mathematical situations. All right, formulas. All right, proving a formula is true. All right, we'll be looking at that. College, for example, in calculus, I had to do to prove the fundamental theorem of calculus. All right, it took like a whole page to do it. The professor made us do it in front of the class and show all the steps and write the reason why, the rule behind every little part of the process of proving that it was or was not true. So that's what this is. This is a very basic foundation that we start looking at to prove if things are true or if they're not true. Right. If you look at our next example there, we have yet another example. It says write the contrapositive of the conditional statement, determine if it's true or false. Then if it's false, give a counterexample. All right. So again, the contrapositive of it. So if you'll take a look at that, we'll talk about it here in just a second. So again, our contrapositive is when we switch our hypothesis and our conclusion on there, and then when we negate it. All right. So when we negate that and go through it, you end up with that. All right, so is that true or false?
True.
If you do not present your ID, then you cannot ask to leave the classroom.
Human rights, you can ask.
You could ask, right? It doesn't mean you're going to get told yes, all right? But you could still ask. So this is in fact false. All right? Just ask to go to to leave without it. You can ask. It doesn't mean I'm going to say yes, but you can ask.
I can't go.
I mean, and not even ask.
All right, so if you look at example 7, notice example 7, we're taking all of that now. All right, we're going to take a statement. We're going to write the conditional statement for it. And then we're going to write the converse, and then we're going to write the inverse of that, and then we're going to write the contrapositive of that. So this is just a summary of showing that you know what the 4 different statements mean. All right? So if you'll go through those, and then we'll go through them here together shortly. So what's our conditional statement going to be? How do I rewrite that with the conditional? All right. If you are a junior, or something close to it, if you are a junior, then you must pass the tax to graduate. All right. And obviously that's not true anymore. There's not a tax test you have to pass. This was a couple years ago.
I thought it was like if a junior passes the tax test and they graduate.
Junior must pass the test in order to graduate. So the conditional, remember, we just put the if then and we keep it in the same order. That's our conditional. So there's something on that line. With a junior, if you are a junior, then to graduate you must pass the tax test. Something in that order. Because the order stays the same for the conditional. That's all that we're doing is adding if and then on the conditional part. So now when I take the converse, what's the converse mean? That's when I do what? That's when I just switch the if and the then part of the statement. So the converse, if you need to pass the tax test to graduate, then you must be a junior. Now the inverse is when we do what? Which one does the inverse relate to? The conditional. All right. So if you are not a junior, then you what? Then you what? What would it be? Then you do not have to pass the tax test. To graduate. And then our last part, the contrapositive, is when we take the converse. So remember, conditional and the inverse are related. Now our converse and our contrapositive are the ones that were related. So if you do not need to pass the tax test, I'll just put tax for short. If you do not need to pass the tax to graduate, then you must not be a junior. So that's our additional types of statements. Yesterday we just talked about conditional and we talked about inverse. So today we've added to that. Yesterday we talked about the conditional and inverse. Today we're looking at the converse and the contrapositive. Now tomorrow's assignment, you'll be going to these types of statements. You'll be given different statements. And then you'll be asked to go through and identify hypothesis, conclusion, write the converse, identify if things are true or false, and to give counter examples of things that are false. That's what we'll be working on tomorrow. Now the last part of today's, I put another one of those puzzles in there for us to look at. So this one should be somewhat easy. Again, it's just a fun part thrown in there for you. So again, tomorrow, with the sub in here, you'll have the reading, and then you will have your part of the assignment, which will be back to actually writing these different types of statements. Remember, guys, all these notes, if you're not here or if you need to reference back for any reason, they're posted on that YouTube channel that's up there on the board.